Well, good evening and welcome to those of you in the big room here and to all of you who are online, either live or watching at a future time. So I say welcome to How to Family Workshop. We are in a series on our Sunday mornings, this sermon series called How to Family. Family is actually a verb there, like how to do family. And we're trying something new because we believe the church ought to be a resource for family. And so every Wednesday, we are following the Sunday morning topic with a dig deeper discussion led by our very own Matt Gallagher, who attends our church and is a licensed Christian therapist here in town. And we're really grateful. So he's going to dive deeper each Wednesday into the subject of the previous Sunday morning topic. Tonight, what we're going to do is I'm going to give a little overview of last Sunday, and then Matt's going to just lead us in that dig deeper. We'll have a little Q&A. Those of you online, you can submit those on Facebook, and Matt Ersman, will help lead the Q&A there, and then we'll be done for the evening. So it's going to be a great evening. Let me pray, and then we'll get started. Father, thank you for family. We know there's always drama. There's always challenges, and so much of the time we live with insecurity and uncertainty and fear and regret and shame, and I pray that by your Spirit we might gain some victory and some insight. Thank you so much for Matt as he leads us tonight, and we just pray over and for our wonderful families in our church and in churches all over Wichita. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, a quick overview of this last Sunday's sermon. King David is our case study each week. He was a great man of God, one of the greatest kings, but his primary deficit was probably his parenting. He was very intentional and successful as a king, but not so much as a parent. Last Sunday, I gave an overview of his parenting, and we walked away with one big idea. You will be as successful as you are intentional. And I shared the importance of a healthy, functional parent needing to be intentional in two ways. They set goals, and then they come up with a plan to accomplish the goal. And I know that sounds simple, but that's a secret to healthy parenting, is you set goals and you tell your kids what your goals are. So your goal might be, we want to raise moral children. Like kind and respectful and nice to people, okay? If that's your goal, you ought to tell your kids, because your kids need to know what your goals are. They need that security, but then you come up with a plan or a strategy for that. And an example I gave on Sunday would be, you would pray every day for your kid. Like, that's a good strategy to implant God's moral character into their life. So you pray every day. Another strategy I gave was you make the regular connection between moral behavior and success. You're always telling your kid, if you're moral and kind and respectful, you'll be more successful on your job, in your school, in your marriage someday. But regardless, to be healthy parents, you need to be intentional. And passive parenting, which is what King David did, usually doesn't lead you to a happy ending. So with all of that, welcome, Matt. Thanks for being here. Go ahead and share, and then we'll be doing some Q&A after that. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brent. I'm honored to be here and thankful for the opportunity to share with you. Like Brent said, I'm a licensed therapist here in town, and it's something I feel called to do, and I feel like I get the privilege of receiving trust from other people. I always tell people, you do the hard work in here, because it's their experience, and I love what I do because I just get to offer support. That's my goal tonight. My hope is that you leave this session feeling encouraged, that we demystify some of the process, because in all the years that, I've pursued training in treatment of trauma and personality assessment and things like that, but I've been working with kids and parents since I started in education, I guess it's decades ago now. So my point is, there's so much tension built into this. I don't want to screw it up, and we'll get into some of those things. And really, we put too much pressure on ourselves because just being present, I guess that would be the starting place. Because when Brent says, don't be a passive parent, that means I'm disengaged. So my challenge is, and my hope is that you'll feel encouraged as you leave here tonight and maybe have some resources or some direction of where to go. I totally agree with Brent's quote. However your kids turn out, don't take too much credit or blame. That's so smart because at some point, it's just their decisions. And if we assume that we are responsible for their successes or failures, don't get me wrong, we have the most influence in a lot of these situations. But after a certain age, our kids are not on remote control. They are making their own choices. They're going to stumble and be clumsy about it in different ways than we did. And we need to give them permission to try, and we need to give ourselves permission to just do our best and take some of the pressure out of this. My wife, Lori, and she's going to join us next week when we talk about discipline. She ran a daycare in our home for 13 years. You probably saw her when she led the kids singing on Christmas service. We call her the toddler whisperer because she's potty trained almost 30 children, and she is uniquely gifted to work with kids and a guru when it comes to discipline. So we both have our own expertise, but when we give parenting workshops, I always include this image of curling from the Olympics. I think it's a perfect metaphor for parenting because, and this is where my expertise in this sport is limited, but as I understand it, they don't get to touch the puck. They just get to brush feverishly trying to influence its trajectory. That's what I think about with parenting, because halfway through, like especially when they enter pre-adolescence, when they get to about middle school age, we're really coaching now. And coaches don't get to go on the field. In fact, there's penalties if they do. And that's what I think of every time I try and intervene too much as with a child and how they're doing. And I'll hear parents say that. A lot of times I'll get that question from parents. I don't want to screw up my kids. Or a colleague sent me an article several years ago, How to Land Your Kid in Therapy. But it was ironic because it was written by a therapist who was describing all of these young adults they were seeing who had relatively idyllic childhoods. No trauma, everything went great, and they were ill-equipped to deal with the challenges of the world. So I guess the first thing I want to encourage you with, kind of like Brent described, don't take too much credit, don't take too much blame. Screwing up our kids, messing up our kids, that applies when we're talking about overt abuse. And part of this is my experience, what I've seen. But I don't think we mess up our kids. I heard one psychologist said, kids grow up in spite of us. So we need to take some of the pressure off. We're not literally molding every bit of clay. I sometimes hear people say things like, well, I don't know if I can just let go and trust God with them. And I hear someone else say, well, God trusted you with them. We're far less equipped than He is in that sense. So my challenge is, messing up our kids applies to abuse, neglect. If you don't talk to them for days or a week at a time, that's bad. And if they experience like this chronic disapproval from you, if you are actively discouraging them, then yeah, that will leave a scar. But I want to strike this balance where I don't want to say that we don't have any influence, because obviously we have huge influence. But when people say, I don't want to put my kids in therapy, and what's interesting, then they realize who they're talking to, like, well, not that therapy's bad. Yeah, I know, it's good. But whatever issues I try and correct from my own childhood experience, I'll create new problems for my kids to talk about. The person who says, my parents were never present, were never there for me, so I'm not going to make this mistake, there's a decent chance they run the risk of smothering their kids. Because there's no way they're going to ignore their kids, and their kids are going to be begging for alone time. So we're always trying to balance the equation, and we're going to do it. Hopefully we're improving the trajectory, but we're going to be as imperfect as anybody else. And that's, I guess, the other thing. So are our kids. They're just as human as we are. One of the things we're going to talk about, one of the biggest distractions, I think, or discouragements, is the shame we experience. And I guess I first want to offer a definition. Guilt is healthy. Guilt suggests that we have a conscience. Shame is toxic. Shame says, I didn't just make a bad choice, I'm a bad person, and no longer qualified to fill in the blank. I like Larry Osborne's direct writing in his book, and that's a pretty blunt title, 10 Dumb Things Smart Christians Believe. Chapter 3 is dedicated to parenting, and he cites the verse from Proverbs 22. And when it comes to theology, I'll always defer to Brent. That's not my training, but I think we all need to gather wisdom where we can. He quotes the verse from Proverbs 22, train up a child in the way they should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. Osborne makes the distinction, this is a proverb. This is an observation. It's not an absolute promise from God. And again, I offer that disclaimer. I could be wrong about that, but that's his approach. And the distinction there is really important because he goes on to describe how many stories he's heard from parents who, when their child deals with addiction or legal issues or can't get traction in school or can't launch in their adulthood, the parents, this is where our faith can turn into a way to judge and shame ourselves. Well, obviously I screwed up or they would have had a job already. Obviously I screwed up or they wouldn't be addicted. And that's my point again. You might have taught them everything right, and there might be something else in how they're wired, in what they experience, that's just beyond your control. Train up a child is really important, but at some point they make their own decisions. And like we started, it's not your fault and you don't get all the credit for it. They have to make their own choices. Shame is one of the reasons we disengage. And depending on how we're wired in our personality, we all have reasons of holding back. Brent did a great job of describing maybe David was so aware of his sin that he was afraid to speak into the life of his kids. That's what I would think of as that exaggerated guilt or that sense of hypocrisy. Well, who am I to speak into my kid's life? By the way, isn't it great that David could be a known adulterer and God's warmonger, conquering? I was reading some of this, like there's some theory that he defeated actual giants, and it starts with Goliath. And there were other, and so isn't it amazing that this fallen, broken man was called a man after God's own heart? It gives me hope that I don't have to be perfect. We keep striving, we try our best, but he did his best. And that's what I love about this series, because when you start looking at, well, what was tough for him, and I don't know what held David back, but this is one of the things I hear from parents, and this is valid. I think Brent had a good theory with that. What if he was so overwrought with his own guilt that he thought, I don't have the authority to speak into my kid's life? And I would challenge, well, then who does? We are never perfect enough to have authority, and we can teach from our mistakes. This is another thing where we have to recognize our limits of control, because you can teach from your own errors, but you don't get to choose whether or not they follow that. Another thing we have to be aware of, and we learn about ourselves throughout our whole lives, but some of us are really sensitive to discomfort. I learned about that in my personality, where I'd come out of a discussion about, theology or politics or just anything, and I thought, wasn't that great? And then, my wife would say, that sounded really kind of heated, or, oh, really? See, some of us think that intensity is welcoming and it means you care, and some of us are really nervous about conflict. We feel that discomfort, and it holds us back. Like, what if my kids don't like what I say? See, I guess I want to challenge you. For those of you gifted with a strong-willed determination, we again need to balance the equation by trying to be a little more sensitive and tone it down. But for those of us that are so empathetic that we feel every emotion in the person across the table from us, we maybe need to back that off and not take responsibility for their feelings. But my kid's not going to like it when I set that boundary. Yeah, I know. That's theirs to deal with. And again, someone might say, well, that's mean or insensitive. No, if you feel all of your kids' disapproval, it will hamstring you as a parent. Part of this is I'm not going to be intimidated by their disapproval. And I heard someone say that's an indication of leadership. Again, we don't want to be completely insensitive to the upset of others, but if everybody agrees with us, we're probably not changing very much. So part of this is being unafraid of change. The other thing would be passive avoidance. Some of us in our personality, we just want to be comfortable or we want to be interested in our own things. So I'm going to just let things go. And these are reasons why we would not engage with our kids. None of us are perfect enough to not have mistakes to reflect on. And I want to encourage you, if you made some of the same mistakes that you see your kids or your grandkids dealing with in those situations, it's important to present it with humility. Who am I to say this? I fell on the same challenge. But when parents communicate struggles that they've dealt with and then how they got out of it, it's uniquely validating for the kids. It gives them a sense of resilience. I can get out of this too. My dad did. My mom did. My grandparents did. Don't be afraid to share your experience. There's limits with that. We don't want to share too much, but that's another discussion. One of the books my wife found for one of our parenting classes is called The Mother's Book of Parenting from 1907. We bought it half out of interest and reference, like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how that's different. And some things are definitely different from 100 years ago. But one of the things that's fascinating is, and again, that's why I titled this, fascinating the idea that you need to speak into your kid's life. Some of us abdicate our role as parents, and some of us accept that role. And I use that terminology because none of us probably see ourselves as officially stepping down from being responsible for our kids, but our actions might show that. I want to be careful with this because this isn't a time where you feel judged or criticized for being a parent. It's just a challenge to recognize, oh, this is my job. I love how the author from 100 years says that. She was actually speaking to how do you teach your kids about sex and relationships and really sensitive topics. And her quote was, you can read that, if we remain silent, we can rest assured the world will not. Someone's going to influence your kids. And again, this is a place of balance. If you never speak into it, I heard one parenting author, he said, if I never tell my kids what I believe, kind of like what Brent was saying, communicate openly, if I never tell them and I say, well, it's better that I lead by example, that's actually really humbling when I hear that, because that suggests that my example is so perfect that there's no way they'll misinterpret it. Now, don't get me wrong. They can tell. The flip side is also true. Kids repeat and practice what they see, not what they hear. So matching up your statements with your actions are critically important as consistency. But it's important to explain, this is what I believe, this is what I think is true. And then we let go again, because they have to make their own choices. One of the things I want to encourage you with is some foundational ideas about where we start. When Brent says set goals and communicate those, the two concepts that I think stand out as much as anything is you have standards of what's acceptable, but even before you get to that, even before you tell your kids about the rules, you empathize with them. One of the last schools I worked at, we had a slogan on our shirt, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. None of this happens without relationship. If you can empathize with your kids, and I want to be clear about this because one of the things we struggle with is We might think we're hanging with them and connecting, but our message might sometimes be, quit having a problem with that. Or we explain it away. Well, yeah, that's just how school is. So when you reflect back what they're saying, when you tell them, yeah, that sounds really hard. And I remember when that was like that for me too. I'm sorry. Don't fix it. Don't brush it aside. Just help them not feel alone. I was always amazed when when I was a counselor at a school, I'd have parents call and say, will you please check on my child? They're terribly upset this morning. And I check in with the child and I said, hey, your mom called. Are you okay? And they looked at me like, what are you talking about? Yeah, I'm fine. And this happened over and over, and what they described was, well, yeah, I talked to mom about it, I talked to dad about it, and now I'm fine, now I'm in school. Being heard is hugely important. In fact, in my field, there's evidence that it changes the brain, creates new pathways, helps us feel different. So being there for your kids, I'm going into that so much because your empathy is one of the biggest things you can provide. And a lot of times as parents, we think, how do I fix this? When we forget that just being there is most of the job. Do they know you're listening? That's it. The other thing is those standards, those boundaries, especially with younger kids, but it's even important with older kids. Older kids need more freedom. They need to experience their own power. We always share the story of the study that showed that playgrounds with elementary schools, when they had a fence around them, the children would range and play all over. When there was no fence, they would cluster towards the center, almost like a flock of children for safety. I know that metaphor doesn't really work, but you get what I'm saying. Like, they need structure. It's a normal thing for those of us that are more empathetic. We want to know that our kids are okay with it. We'll even give them an instruction. Clean up your room, okay? It's not a vote. I'm saying all of this to encourage your power. Feel free to tell them whatever you want. If they feel loved and like you're present, they will also complain when they're asked to do chores, and that would be a good time for you to be deaf to that. I love you, I'm here for you, clean your room, and you turn and walk. That's important. The other thing, I want to emphasize this. We all practice and rehearse. We all replicate whatever we grew up with. And then we project it through our personality. So realistically, you're doing what you experienced, and you're doing it uniquely through your personality. And again, this is not another one of those moments where I'm trying to shame or call you out with any of that. Just simple acceptance. Like for some of us in our personality, oh, I'm a lot. And for some of us, it's tough for us to speak truth. Reach outside of your default of what you grew up with. Read a book, attend a talk like this. Look for other ideas to give yourself resources. You don't have to bring it all from yourself. You don't have to know it all. And that's a thing we often hear people say, well, there's no manual for this, or I don't know what to do. Yeah, but there's thousands of books written about this. Ask around. Years ago, Newsweek magazine asked parents, what do you want for your kids? And it was interesting. The top two answers, like Brent said, I want kids to be moral. Parents said, I want my kids to be moral, and I want them to be happy. And one psychologist observed, that's ironic because the things that teach them to be moral often don't make them happy. So what's interesting, though, they still work together because if you live, and I love that approach of what Brent described, if we teach our kids to live by moral standards and live authentic to what they believe, they will be happier. One psychologist said happiness as a goal is a terrible idea because it turns into an indulgence of our appetites and our feelings. If we follow what we believe is true, and I know that's a huge statement because that's made in 1,000 decisions every day. But if we follow that standard, we will be happier. The other thing I want to emphasize is the importance of struggle. It is always easier for us to tie his shoes. We do it faster and better. But in those simple decisions, it's easier to point to the value of him learning. Well, he's got to learn sometime. Because if he's wearing Velcro or flip-flops, and well, I guess that's more normal, but he's going to learn to tie his shoes sometime. And the first few times, it's going to be painful to watch. And these, we'll get to that in a minute, but these are the simple ones. Anybody who's taught a child to drive knows that's an entirely different stress experience, but they have to learn. Recognize the challenge of struggle and the importance of not fixing it for them, because we can always do it better. One of the things that caught my attention when Brent spoke about David and his sons, he talked about everyone throughout ages in their life. And some of the talks I've given on parenting adult children reminded me of this, because we're getting into a different dynamic. When David's son violated his daughter, David burned with anger, but he didn't do anything. And his son burned with anger, and the clock started ticking. Now this is Matt's interpretation, but that's what I picture. Someone will speak into it. And what's really tricky is I've just spent some time describing how your kids need freedom to learn how to use their power, but that doesn't mean that we're absent from the picture. We need to ask permission for input. One person, but we definitely need to be present enough to be able to give it. I heard somebody describe that energy without direction is just chaos. And direction without any energy never gets started. See, if David's son was outraged about what happened and David didn't speak into it, that's a very tangible example of let's ignore the problem and hope it goes away, as opposed to confront what we're all upset about and no one wants to talk about. I don't know if David was checked out. I don't know if he no longer felt relevant. I don't know if he was, I don't know. But I think Brent makes a great point that what we do know is he didn't speak into, or we don't have an example of him speaking into this, and a crime like this would not go unanswered. There's some things, has anybody had something go wrong in their car or their house and then all of a sudden it fixed itself? Aren't those the best moments? Oh, look, the light went out. Yay. Thank you. Reset. That usually doesn't happen in relationships. I know we're not as simple, we're not linear like machines and computers, but there's research to suggest that we start stacking up disagreements and we log those, and it goes in our library, and it gives us an idea of what to expect next time. So if we don't address the things that are going wrong, it doesn't usually get better. Usually it festers. I forgot to mention, this is really important too. Grandparents can be hugely important in offering support, but that's contingent. That's why I emphasize permission. Even as for us as adults, for our children, I remember when our kids were little, somebody said, well, these are the easiest problems we ever deal with. And I thought, we're not sleeping. What do you mean? This is terrible. But no one's had a toddler dealing with substance abuse or legal issues, or at least not that I know of. And not to go dark with that, but those younger experiences sometimes are the simplest. And it gets more complicated, which is my point. It's really important that we're present and connected there. Grandparents can be a huge source of support and wisdom. And the sticking point that I usually see is as long as there's not a power struggle. And I say that in general because for those of us working through whatever stage of adulthood we're in, we all know times when we're too proud to take advice. And by the same token, there's times where people are mixing into our life and offering advice that we never asked for. Those are really common power struggles. We'll talk more about that. This sounds really simple, but I think most of us recognize that just because we're not having open conflict doesn't mean we're really at peace with each other. Most of you have probably been in a family experience, a holiday meal, something like that, where you can cut the tension. Like, wow, that felt chilly. See, maintaining enough openness to discuss what we're upset about requires a lot of trust and vulnerability. That's also one of the reasons why we don't speak in. That's what we were talking about before. If David thought he was too much of a hypocrite, who am I to speak into this? Or maybe he had so much conflict through life he didn't want more. You know what? They'll figure it out. We have to be courageous and stable enough to risk that discomfort. Another thing that's tricky is sometimes we'll say we're being honest. What? It's just the truth. But it's really one-sided truth where I'm pointing at the errors in your life. What's really more complicated is if we're vulnerable enough to say, I'm really afraid this is going to go bad, and I want to support you, but I recognize your choice to choose. I love you enough to speak into this, but I also don't want to create more conflict. That's a really vulnerable statement. We talk about what we're afraid of, what we hope for, what we need. Again, going along that line of passivity, there is a time for us to speak and a time for us to listen. But if you are completely silent, you might as well be giving permission. Looking for that right moment is really important. The other thing I have to put in a plug for any of us from the 80s. One of the reasons the Breakfast Club and movies like that appeal to us is we see the truth in it. And you would parent all of those kids differently. I don't know what David's kids were like. They were all powerful. I don't know if they were entitled as the sons of kings. I don't know if they were impatient. But some of our kids, we need to be playful and not take too much seriously. One of the things I've discovered in personality assessment is each of our kids are wired differently. And you don't get to choose. So when parents say things like, oh, they're all so different, and I had to relearn it, and you're right. And we're all dealing with some version of that. So for some of our kids, we can be playful, and that will give them permission. For some, and I know you can read through that, but to be respectful and treat them like an adult even though they're 10, because they were born in charge, and they're going to lead. Some just want to know that they're okay. And you barely have to raise an eyebrow before they immediately feel bad. And you have to encourage them to believe in themselves. No, it's okay. Some want creativity, and for that to be fed, and to have permission to think outside the box. You're right. It doesn't always have to be how I grew up. And some, here's what's really tricky. That's why I say all this humbly. It's really easy for me to sit up here and say, well, this is how you should do it, because everybody can give broad strokes. This is really difficult when we get down into the moments. Because on one hand, I'd say you need to be nurturing, but I also know I shouldn't say plenty because they're not as common, but if your child is born as the alpha, and they are in charge from the start, and they have their own idea from the start, they're going to respond to strength. That doesn't mean that we're abusive or hard or uncaring. But if you're nervous about their disapproval, they'll run you. We would parent all of those kids differently, and that's okay. Okay, this is probably the closest I'll get to trying to call us out, but I've read articles lately that talk about how many parents are disengaged on their phones, or in some ways, we are more connected in activities than ever, but we're also busier and spread out more than ever. So I want to emphasize the importance of connecting because, and I don't know where I heard that, but I always remember that quote, rules without relationship leads to a rebellion. This is one of the things I thought about with David and his kids too. Because, well, similar to, there's some extreme stories where mom and dad are heirs of whatever fortune. And to cross them means you get written out of the will. So in those dynamics, and there's been movies and shows and books written to demonstrate this dynamic where my parent is too powerful, and think about that, he's the king. My parent is too powerful to disagree with, but I also don't feel heard or appreciated by him. And it just creates resentment. Oh yeah, I'll toe the line, but the minute I see a chance, and 2 of his sons threw coups. See, that's the point. People, and you see this in a variety of leadership settings, if people think their leader believes in them and really cares about them, they'll do anything for them. And when they feel like they're just taken for granted, that's where the relationship dies and the conflict starts. So I don't want to just throw out phones and things like that, but we have busy lives and more options and opportunities than ever, and we have a chance to disengage. I always think about, and I say this humbly, I think about this for myself. I don't want this to turn into the self-loathing dynamic of we are so privileged, but all of us, especially in this zip code by definition, are wealthy by world standards. That's why people make jokes about first world problems. It's still fair, they're still our problems. But I think about the parable of the sower, and the seeds are choked out by the worries of this life and deceitfulness of wealth. One of the things, and I want to be careful I don't sound bright side with this, but one of the things I'm hopeful for, I've heard some people describe as much as they hate pandemic and quarantine, we've never spent so much time playing games. We've never gone on so many walks together. We've never, as options are limited, some families are connecting more. Some relationships are connecting more. It's also gone dark for some people. I want to be sensitive to that because they don't have meaningful or helpful relationships. It's just, they're trapped now. And we need to be sensitive to that. But stepping back and connecting with the people we care about most is really our path to any of these connections. And I want to encourage you, it's never too late. You'll influence by helping people know they care. And what's interesting, often we will engage when we see enough reason to. Something catches our attention, or a problem turns up the heat enough that, okay, something's got to change. Because often those are limited by our fear of, I don't know how this will go, or I'm afraid you'll be upset with me, or I'm afraid I'll screw this up, or maybe in our pride. I've heard Brent mention that several times. To start a positive habit, we have to first confront the fact that we haven't been doing it up till now. And I don't want to make light of that, but we do have to get over that. Yeah, I know, and that was yesterday. So when do you want to start this? This balance of speaking truth and love is easier when we're more vulnerable. Even though that's scary, I can tell you what I'm concerned about. If you and I have enough relationship, and it's not in judgment of you, here's what I hope for, here's the support I'm offering, no pressure. If we have enough sense of caring for one another, that's our best chance of permission. And parenting our kids is a marathon, not a sprint. My hope is this is encouraging to you tonight because none of us are perfect, and I really do believe no one has more influence on our kids than we do, and they grow up in spite of us. It's way bigger than us. In a healthy way, we can get over ourselves and let go of the control we never really had in the first place. So, thanks for having me, and I'm open to questions. Oh, Mother's book was written by, last name was Burrell. I forgot who. Yeah, it was a fascinating perspective. Hey, Matt.
I'm self-conscious that I'm wearing flip-flops. I can't tie my shoes, in case you were wondering.
No judgment.
Okay, thank you. So if you're watching on Facebook, I've got the Facebook feed pulled up here, and if you have any questions, I'll be directing those to Matt. And if you're in the room, you can raise your hand. Kim's got a mic, and she'll kind of roam. So if you have any questions now in the room, Kim will come to you. And if you are watching live online, I'd love to answer your or I'll direct your questions to Matt as well. So open Q&A time. We do have one on Facebook already, Matt, so we'll start with this one. When dealing with older elementary or middle school children, what advice do you have for phone usage and social media?
Oh, that's a good one.
Really easy one to start with.
One of the things first thing I think of is watching my daughter when she was 8 or 9 out in the activity center, and she's sitting with a tablet she brought to church because we had a meeting that afternoon, and there's 10 kids surrounding her. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, that's a battle not worth fighting. Like, it's so compelling. So I don't want to avoid the question, but what's interesting, when we look for hard and fast rules, we're looking for some certainty or some guarantee. So what's going to work? I know some parents who don't put any guidelines on their kids' feeds, and I want to be careful with that, because elementary, adolescent, it's important to put some, like it's a good standard. If my kids are on a social media platform, I'm on there too. I have their passwords. I have access. It's good to not, there's no other situation where we would let our kids self-regulate completely, especially if you're talking about anywhere up to like mid-adolescence, and it really depends on your kid. So that's why I said I'm not trying to avoid the question, but there's not a hard and fast rule. Some self-regulation needs to be taught. And the standard I usually look for is, how does it affect their life? If they're managing it themselves and they're not getting in any trouble and they're getting their work done in school and they have healthy relationships and they're involved in activities, and you pick up their phone and say, okay, I need to read your text now, well, you're probably harming trust because they're doing everything right, and now comes your authority and control. What purpose is that serving? So giving them some standard, helping them regulate themselves is the key, and really protecting them from some of the risk that comes with that is also really important. Filtering in the home, unfiltered internet access is pretty risky. We could probably go a lot of other directions. That was a good question. Thanks for the fastball.
Matt, I have a question. The role of family of origin and personality, two different things, on your passive parenting. So what do you do in terms of self-awareness, so you have a family story and an example. How do you break that family of origin cycle? And then you've got passive personality. So I don't know what the question is, but I'm just saying family of origin and personality, and that impact into our parenting. What do we do?
Great question. There's been a lot written about mismatch of temperament. One of the things I've seen often is where you have a really sensitive, caring parent, and honestly, I see those examples a lot, where you have a sensitive, caring parent and they're nurturing, and they would have never disrespected their children. And they give birth to this dominant alpha child who's not that sensitive. And by the way, that I don't get that question very much, but I heard somebody say, like, their 9-year-old boy is not very caring and has no empathy and pretty aggressive. Is he a sociopath? No, he's 9. His empathy hasn't grown yet. It's going to probably be fine. Again, I want to be careful not to sound dismissive of any of these concerns, but again, to take some of the pressure off that let's not borrow trouble and anticipate problems. This is another instance where I guess I find myself saying, I don't want to avoid the question, and you're not going to change who you are. And you're probably not going to change who your child is. In fact, my wife read a quote recently in a parenting magazine where it said, we sometimes have this contradictory message. I want you to be passive and compliant now when I'm sending you to bed. But as you go to school, I want you to be dominant and protect yourself from bullying. We don't get it both ways. So the theme you see in some of this presentation is, and I say that humbly because I have to practice it and often fail at it, but how do we just accept who we are and then accept who they are and find that balance? Because it's not going to change. And when you find that acceptance, you give each other permission. And we actually can sync up really well. Because we all have, even if our personalities are very different, there's things that we're united around. Oh, you love to play games too? Oh yeah, me too. Now I don't want to fight about it, or I do want to fight about it. But we find ways to unite us rather than what divides us. Yeah, that was a good one too.
Got a couple more on Facebook here, so I'll start with this one, Matt. So what ramifications and behavior molding do mental health experts think COVID will create?
Oh, great question. It's interesting, depending on who you read, there's a lot of understandable concern for this. And I've heard this from parents too, like, what's this going to mean for my kids going back to school? I'm pausing because I don't want to just depend on my own experience, but I always remember, and I heard an educator say this the other day, well, kids are the easiest to work with. They were coming from a situation of working with adults. What's interesting, our kids are the most resilient population we have. So this is another thing I want to be careful about the balance. We need to empathize with them. We need to support them, equip them, and give them every resource. But what's interesting, if we offer too much empathy, it actually lowers their resilience. I guess another way to say this is, if they think you're going to rescue them, they don't try as hard. I always use the example of when kids go down a slipper slide, and if they fall off the end and skin their knee, they immediately look up. And if they lock eyes with a parent, they usually cry. And if there's no parent present, they get up and run. Now, if there's a serious injury, obviously they cry. But my point is, our expectation changes depending on who's around us. So, in some ways, we've never been more equipped for pandemic and quarantine, because I saw that from some, especially adolescents, where their super structured schedule loosened up and they just got to play games with friends and chat on their phones, and they stayed connected, and it was great. Their stress actually went down. But we're also seeing the tipping point where we are social beings and we need to be connected with people, and this feels way better than through a screen. So we are seeing some dynamic where kids are hungry for interaction. The other thing, I think your question kind of speaks to this too. There's developing research on something we call environmental traumas. And some of the things we've talked about is kids who are now in middle school and high school, they've grown up post 9/11. So talking about terrorism and threats, and depending on the news cycle, and how contentious political discussions are or things like that. I've heard some therapists say, turn off the news at home, please. Let's see if that helps your child. Kids have more to worry about than ever. And what's ironic, in some ways, they have less to worry about than ever. You never been more resourced. You never have more provision. We've never been more aware and watchful. There's active anti-bullying campaigns. There's all these things that work. But then the headlines show climate change, pandemic, all these other things. So to bring that to a point, I'd say we need to give our kids reasons to hope in the midst of threats, because especially for our younger kids, they're going to follow our lead. They always do. I guess not always, but they often do. They'll look at us and they'll look to see if we are worried. And if we are worried, they are too.
That's good. Got a couple more online if there's not any in the room here. So what can moms and dads do to reconnect with their children when media has been too strong a presence for too long?
Oh, you mean take away their games? Good luck. Yeah, I don't want to sound flippant with that too much. In fact, that's maybe a good point to offer too. Sometimes parents say things like they want to keep playing and they won't come upstairs when I call them. And it's interesting, depending on what you read. Some people say screen time should be limited, no more than an hour a day. And other people say pandemic and quarantine, we need to relax, this is their outlet. Sometimes parents have asked, like, why don't they go play outside? And what they're referring to is like we did. And what I usually point out is because all their friends are online. And the pickup game, the football game, the baseball game is actually in the chat session, the lobby waiting to load the next match. So, again, I want to get back to the question, but one thing you can do is offer some grace and interest in what they're playing. Because if you pull them from the game and say, I said now, it's time to eat, they are sometimes abandoning 8 of their friends that are depending on them in that match. Give them a few minutes. And if they're still playing 10 minutes later and they're restarting and stuff like that, that's a place where they need to learn self-regulation. But the other thing is recognize what you're competing with. It needs to be good. It needs to be important. It needs to be safe and fun. If they don't want to play games because they're worried you're going to get upset, or if it's really boring to them, find something that intersects. That's one of the ways we can connect. And I want to be careful with that because nothing gives us the stimuli like an online game. You can't compete with Xbox. But nothing has the power like their relationship with you. So little bursts, respect their interest, and show interest as much as you can. Great question. Wow.
Got a couple more here. So if a child pushes back on a parent being too involved in their lives, how does a parent know when to stay involved and when to step back?
Yeah, wow. Will you read that first part
Sure,
again?
yeah.
Sorry, I went somewhere else there.
If a child pushes back on a parent being too involved in their lives, how does a parent know when to stay involved and when to step back?
Great question. Some of the factors that come into play with that, the first thing I think of is there needs to be a reason, and depending on the age. And if some of this sounds like I'm overqualifying it, it's because it's as unique and as varied as your kids are. I could think of 14-year-olds that are still probably too dependent on their parents, and I can think of 8-year-olds that are ready to be more independent. I'm not saying leave your 8-year-old home alone, but what I'm suggesting is know your child, and if they're living life and doing it on their own and not creating damage to themselves or chaos in the home, then that is really important to respect their boundaries. That's one of the things that I've recognized in personality. Like, we can't ever ignore our kids, and they need to feel connected to check in with them. But for some of our kids, if they're coloring, drawing, reading in their room for hours, they're maybe not unhappy about that. Maybe they love it. And what's interesting, a lot of times our interventions are more about what we need than what they need. So The factors that come into play with this is the age of the child, how you know that they're wired. If they've been really outgoing and connected and relational and all of a sudden they withdraw and they don't want you in their life at all, and they're 10, what's going on? I'd pay attention to that. I'd check in. If they're 14 and they're becoming more independent and they want a little more alone time, and you just want to be their buddy and with them all the time, you're crowding them. So the bottom line in that is we need a reason to engage. Always stay in touch, always check in, but we need a reason to intervene. Otherwise, we need to respect their independence, especially as they get older. I want to be careful as we're moving through this with questions too. Part of the hesitation you're seeing from me is these questions and their answers are as unique and varied as you and your child. So if you're ever concerned about their safety or their well-being, or it just doesn't seem to click, see somebody about that. There's a lot of therapists, counselors. See somebody you trust, and check in with somebody. I'm not trying to sell appointments or anything, but I want you to be careful with your kids. Get the support you deserve.
I want to make sure we honor the room. Any questions here? Kim has one, maybe.
I have one. You spoke earlier in the evening kind of a little bit about the difference between guilt and shame and being motivated by those things or held back by those things. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between the two? And sub-question, is there ever a helpful level of guilt?
Is there ever a helpful level of guilt?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, great question. Wow. So again, guilt, some people would say that's evidence that you have a conscience. I always like, Brent has a phrase he always uses, I feel bad but not guilty. Like, oh, that, and it refers to sympathy, or at least, I don't want to speak for him, but it refers to, I feel bad that that happened. There's some sympathy or empathy in that. Guilt would be, like, if I scratched your car, I should feel guilty about that. Because I don't want to harm your property, and I want to, or if I said something that discouraged you, oh, I feel bad about that. I might even feel guilty if I was reckless, or it's something I think I should have known better about. Like, well, yeah, you should be more careful. So guilt means I care, and guilt means I'm going to try and do the right thing. Exaggerated guilt is where I'm so responsible that it starts to become obsessive, and I start to expect myself to be perfect. So a healthy guilt would be, I'm conscientious. An unhealthy guilt starts to move into obsessions where I don't give myself a break, and then we start tipping into shame. And shame is where I'm calling myself names, or I'm calling someone else names. I said this recently. That whole phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. I mean, sticks and stones hurt, but usually we remember what people tell us, sometimes decades later. So how we say things and what we say is really important. Our words are really powerful, and they just happen so quickly and easily. So when we call names, we shame other people. If we call ourselves names, why did you say that, Matt? That was stupid. Not you. So when we start hating ourselves and distrusting ourselves and actively resenting ourselves, that becomes like an inner, it's corrosive. It's demoralizing. It's literally depressing, because why would I even try? I'm no good. That's illness. And that's shame. Some people would ask, maybe, aren't there other definitions? When someone says, have you no shame, it would be a sense of, do you not have a sense of, and maybe I'm saying this wrong, but a sense of propriety, or will you try and do the right thing? As opposed to, do you just blast through all these boundaries and not care? That would be a different dynamic of shame. That's not what I'm referring to. Self-loathing is what I'm talking about. Great question.
At least one more online here. I want to be careful with their time too, but this is a good one, especially timely right now. I've heard parents trying to make the school decision of online versus in-person school, struggling because each child's personality is different. And they want the best for that child. So what are some personality factors to consider when making those school decisions?
Great question. That's the other thing too. I don't want to seem too hard and fast, like we can treat personality like a formula, because again, the underlying principle is we are all social creatures. I love the fact that we've had safe online church service opportunities, but boy, that's not the same, right? And I empathize with anybody performing or speaking up here. There's an energy when you've got an audience. So regardless how your kids are wired, they need contact with people. It also depends. So here's an example. If you've got a child that's deeply introverted, like they crave being alone, and when they are alone, their batteries recharge, it's actually great. They're not lonely. Being at home might be great, but I've actually been surprised seeing some situations where they had a good routine at school. They'll tell you they don't like school. They'll tell you they don't want to go to school, but they can actually be a little more anonymous at school than they can at home because they can't hide there because you can come into my room. See, that's the other thing. Some people would say, well, it's my house. Knock on your kid's door unless you have a safety reason not to. But back to the question about school choice, I think of the recent decisions about participation in activities. That's another factor. Regardless of how you're wired, each of these activities, they're part of your kids' life goals. There's grief in all of these losses. And that's the other thing I guess I should point out. Some of these experiences are so unique because we're all going through them together. So I'm not saying that as a unifying factor. I'm saying it actually creates an obstacle for us to judge it. Sometimes we will be tough on ourselves because we think, well, everyone else is dealing with this too. What's my problem? And it keeps us from recognizing that we're actually really sad that we don't get to see our friends or that we didn't get to be a part of this senior year experience. That's tragic. I think the best we can do as parents is talk through the options with our kids and try and paint a picture for them so they can walk through it, because depending on how they're wired, but mostly because of their life experience, there's a ton of things they will not anticipate. So have them make a choice and then walk them through it. Okay, this is what you'll gain, this is what you'll lose, and this is what your day will look like. How does that feel? What do you think of that? Tell me how you like that. And then they get to consider, almost in a simulated real time, oh, actually, I would hate that. Yeah, I want to go to school. Or, oh, I have a unique opportunity to work online at home. Permission with testing is part of what I'm describing. Great question.
Got one more online here, and it's actually good, maybe transition for next week, because I believe we're talking about this on Sunday next week. But speaking about parenting and respecting our kids related to discipline, can you define the difference between discipline and punishment and give a couple examples of each?
Great question, and I love that because so there's 3 parenting models that one psychologist put out, that we have permissive parents, authoritative parents, and then authoritarian. And on that spectrum, the permissive can often be more of a buddy, and there's less discipline and less structure, and the authoritarian locks everything down and controls it. The authoritative parent is clearly in charge, but doesn't have to control everything. And I go into that because that's how I think of punishment versus discipline. Punishment is a negative reinforcement that almost wants to see them feel it. In fact, and I want to be careful with this because I'm definitely not trying to coach suffering but punishment is like, that's it, you're grounded for 3 months. And again, I want to be respectful for any decisions that parents make. You have to do what's right in your mind by your kids. But I use that example because 3 months for an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old might as well be eternity. Like, what does that even mean? So some of those big things, like, that's fine, you're grounded. I'm taking your Xbox. You don't get to see your friends. I'm taking your phone. Punishment means I'm putting this pain in your life that you're going to be upset about. Whereas discipline is just a way of ensuring consequences. I always encourage discipline because it's about natural consequences. That's why I often teach a love and logic model, because it's not adversarial with your kids. It's almost like partnering with them by not fixing and not turning the screws on them too. Kind of like, I'm so sorry you chose that. I wanted to take you out to this place, but I can't do that now because now I have to clean all this up. Or, yeah, you can do that as soon as or, when the Wi-Fi is shut off and the phone goes dead, you've got their attention. And we don't have to have a discussion. And it doesn't have to have a timeline. It's just off until you do what I asked you to. No power struggle. So that's what I distinguish. Punishment often creates a power struggle and resentment, and it's arbitrary. Discipline has a goal, and it's a natural consequence, and we're still good. That's one of the biggest challenges, and it's kind of fun when you get it right. If you walk out of your kid's room with the phone in the air, and I don't mean grab it out of their hand, that's confrontational, but when you walk out of the room with the phone in the air, you don't have to say a word. They will follow you. Almost guarantee it. No power struggle. When you're done with this, you get this back. Great question. My wife, Lori, is going to join us next week, like I said, when we talk about discipline. Fun strategy. It is fun when it works because we don't have to be at odds with our kids. And they're learning, and so are we.
That's good. All right, any more questions in the room? I think we've got 3 other ones on Facebook. So, Matt, that's been awesome. Thank you. And Brent, am I right that discipline is the topic for this Sunday? Is that right? So I'll be going further into that this Sunday. So if you're watching online or here in the room, 8:15, 9:30, or 11, we'd love to have you. We'll continue that study on Sunday, and then Matt and Lori will be here next Wednesday to continue this. So we'd love to continue to have any questions, or we'll look forward to your teaching next week there as well. And one more thing, I wanted to give a quick plug for any young couples in the room or watching online. We have this new thing we're doing called AMA, Ask Me Anything, where we're pairing younger couples with older couples in our church, and it's just a time for them to dialogue, go out to eat together, and just ask any questions and just kind of be real and honest about any struggles or any questions you might have. We would love to have any young couples in our church sign up. And actually, if you'd like to be one of the older couples, you can also sign up at that same URL, firsttomeetchurch.org/AMA. So, all right, if there's nothing else here, I think we'll wrap it up here tonight. So, Matt, thank you again for being here tonight, and thanks for all of you who were in the room and for those watching online. Matt, would you mind closing in prayer for us before we leave?
Lord Jesus, thank you so much for the chance we have to meet together, for a sense of community that carries us through difficult times, for the reasons for hope that you give us. And Lord, I ask that you'd guide our steps and our actions, help us to show the love that you taught us, and lead us with your wisdom. I ask that you protect us and guide us in ways that only you know. I ask all these things in your name and for your glory, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. All right, thanks for being here, everybody. Hope to see you on Sunday and back here next week. Thanks.